Hello, hello, everybody. It has been a while. If you can hear me over on Periscope via Twitter or YouTube, please let me know how the audio is. If you are a first-time watcher of a live stream, if it seems a bit echoey, as you can see, I stream in a hardwood room, so just gonna have to deal with it. But I'm back. This is my first live stream of 2021. Excited about it. Crazy stuff going on, so I'm gonna wait a little bit. You guys let me know. Let's get the YouTube stream up here. Alright, I'm getting confirmation on YouTube that you guys can hear me. That's awesome. If, let me get my combined chat here going really quick. This will let me see all chats at the same time, which would be nice. Okay, alright, how are we feeling, everybody? This is going to be a live stream. I am going to just be reading The Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. So we're going to get into that. But first, I just wanted to open up with a little bit, not of a rant, just kind of, you guys know, if you've been here before, my streams are comfy streams, usually. And I don't want to ruin that vibe. And even though we're reading Anatomy of the State tonight, I want it to be a comfy vibe, and there's a reason for that. So, we've all seen what's been going on over the past couple days. Apps are being banned from app stores. People are being banned en masse off of Twitter, usually of a certain persuasion, if you catch my drift. And I've seen libertarians and conservatives alike apologizing and scrambling to move to other platforms and being very worried and kind of screeching about some things and infighting and all sorts of things. So there's a few things that I want you guys to know. I want you all to know where I'm at, my mindset, why I'm doing this live stream, why I think it's important, what my feelings are about basically the past week. And I am very optimistic. Now, you're probably thinking, how could I possibly be optimistic? I sent out a tweet over the past few weeks saying, you can be black-pilled, you can be nihilistic if you want, but don't try to drag me down with you, because I have a lot of hope for the future. And I know that that's not something a lot of people have right now, but I do. And the reason for that is, I truly believe the current point the United States is at right now, the current events, the feeling in the air, everyone just seems really tense. I think we are being given, as liberty-minded individuals, let's say, you don't even necessarily have to be libertarian. If this is one of your first times watching my live streams, welcome. You are in for a hell of a red pill, I think, listening to this live stream. Hopefully, we'll see. You, as a liberty-minded person or someone who may have not considered these options but is now, over the past week, suddenly realizing that maybe things aren't exactly how you thought they were, and maybe there are other options. That is why I think we are being given the best opportunity in my lifetime, I think, at least. As we know, certain things that went down in 2019 that are now being dragged into 2021 potentially have happened. People have been unable to run their businesses, have been unable to hold their grandma's hand if she passes away. I personally had a great uncle pass away this past year, and it was a horrible experience going to a funeral during this time. You all know why. People were barred from hospital rooms, unable to watch their wives give birth to their children. You guys get the deal. So I'm optimistic with all that. And the reason is, I think liberty-minded people are in the best positioned place that we could possibly be. We've been warning people for decades, not myself. People before I was even alive were warning people that these things would come to fruition or could potentially come to fruition. Emergencies are precedents for lockdowns, are precedents for wars. We've been telling people this as a movement, quote unquote, for literal decades. And most of their predictions have come true. And to me, that is not cause for a nihilistic outlook. That is cause for, we have so much evidence that we have said all of this is going to happen. And we can offer a solution, an alternative, at least to look into. I'm not asking you tonight to listen to me read Anatomy of the State and become an anarcho-capitalist. That'd be awesome, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking you, no matter where you're coming from, whether this is a refresher for libertarian philosophy for you, whether this is your first time hearing this, I don't care where you come from. I want you to listen to this and consider that the way that you have thought about things, probably for your entire life, the way your parents taught you to think about things, the way your teachers taught you to think about things, are incorrect. And that that's okay. And that recognizing that is just one part of what you need to do. But that's where we're going to start. And like I said, I think we're in the best position we've been in a very long time to make people start really considering and thinking about these ideas like Murray Rothbard wrote about. And I think that is so important. I've seen so many content creators, libertarian, conservative, whatever, like, preaching to people and using this as a chance to dunk on people. And don't get me wrong, I love a good dunk on people, but I also want to take this opportunity to welcome people who, like I said, might actually want to be welcomed now. And they're feeling very isolated and very betrayed, and there is an alternative. So just consider it. I'm not asking you to fly a libertarian flag, to fly an anarcho-capitalist flag. I'm just asking you to look into it, because I think right now millions of people across the United States have an unsettled, stirring feeling that something just isn't right, but they can't put their finger on what it is. And I think Murray Rothbard in Anatomy of the State puts his finger on exactly what doesn't feel right in America and hasn't felt right for a very, very, very long time. And we are just seeing what has accumulated because of that over the past few decades. So, I'm going to pause. Thanks for listening to my little intro there. I hope you guys get the point. I hope you enjoy this stream. At the end of me reading, I will go back through comments, have a discussion with you guys. I'm planning on streaming for about an hour and a half. We'll see. I'm going to go through opening comments right now. Again, thank you for everybody who's joining, who's watching. For those of you on Periscope, the chat that I use, Restream, is a little delayed, so I will see your comments right now. They just might be more delayed than YouTube comments. So, thank you guys. So, everyone's saying hello. Hello, Emo Hoppian, RC Scott, Steven. Hey, what's up? Kyle, what's up? Kyle said, I'm with you. The actions today are showing the hand of big tech as well as how scared they are. Exactly. Exactly. Abraham Sandwich said, I don't know if I'm ready to fly the libertarian flag just yet, but I'm tired of the government. I think a lot of people are feeling that. Mr. Behavior, what's up? Thanks for stopping by. Art says, buenas noches. Thank you, thank you. Hello, hello. On YouTube said, do you think the politicians are afraid? Yes. I think they're all afraid. I think we're seeing evidence of that by judging by the slaughter on social media that's going on right now. So fingers crossed I don't get taken down in the middle stream, right? So, Art said, I can't see the rest of the chat in Periscope. You know, I've been having that issue too. I'm not really sure why. I don't know why that is. All right. So, looks like we got a decent amount of people watching. You guys have heard me yammer on enough. I will say, RC Scott said, I'm just here to listen to you do a New York accent. I cannot do any accent. other than the one that I am stuck with. So I will say, if you are listening to this and you're a person that's a visual person, I don't actually have a print copy of this book. So crazy. I looked through a bunch of my boxes. I have a feeling that it might still be where I'm storing some of my things. We did move last year. So I am going to read it off of Mises.org, MISES.org. You can go to that /library/anatomy-state. You can follow along. So if you want to follow along with me reading this, that's great. This isn't meant to be some sort of ASMR thing. That's not my thing. My voice is definitely not suited for it. I just want this up on my channel so that I have documentation and I have a video I can send people to where they can listen to this. And there's also an audiobook on Mises.org if you want to listen to a more audiobook friendly voice read it. But you can order Anatomy of the State at Mises.org. You can read the free PDF. The audiobook's free. The audiobook's about an hour long. So I guess we're just going to get started. So it's really interesting. It's been a while since I have dove into this. I read this, I want to say 3 years ago. This actually isn't the book that got me started on my journey. The book that got me started on my journey, funny enough, was The Law by Bastiat. But I did read Anatomy of the State, and I had already been considering these ideas, but this kind of just hit the nail on the head for me. And so I think it's a really good place to start. Abraham Sanders said, if you start whispering and crinkling paper into the mic like ASMR videos, I'm leaving. I'm not. The only thing I do have is a glass of water because I figure I might get thirsty, but that's it. So we're just going to get started. So it starts out with a quote from Rothbard: the greatest danger to the state is independent intellectual criticism. One of my personal favorite quotes. We'll just let that sink in for itself. So it is divided into sections. The first section is what the state is not. What the state is not. The state is almost universally considered an institution of social service. Some theorists venerate the state as the apotheosis of society. Others regard it as an amiable, though often inefficient, organization for achieving social ends, but almost all regard it as a necessary means for achieving the goals of mankind, a means to be ranged against the, quote, private sector, and often winning in this competition of resources. With the rise of democracy, the identification of the state with society has been redoubled, until it is common to hear sentiments expressed which violate virtually every tenet of reason and common sense, such as, we are the government. The useful collective term we has enabled an ideological camouflage to be thrown over the reality of political life. If we are the government, then anything a government does to an individual is not only just and untyrannical, but also a voluntary on the part of the individual concerned. If the government has incurred a huge public debt which must be paid by taxing one group for the benefit of another, this reality of burden is obscured by saying that we owe it to ourselves. If the government conscripts a man or throws him into jail for dissident opinion, then he is doing it to himself, and therefore nothing untoward has occurred. Under this reasoning, any Jews murdered by the Nazi government were not murdered. Instead, they must have committed suicide, since they were the government, which was democratically chosen, and therefore anything the government did to them was voluntary on their part. One would not think it necessary to belabor this point, and yet an overwhelming bulk of people hold this fallacy to a greater or lesser degree. We must therefore emphasize that we are not the government. The government is not us. The government does not in any accurate sense represent the majority of people. But even if it did, even if 70% of the people decided to murder the remaining 30%, this would still be murder and would not be voluntary suicide on the part of the slaughtered minority. No organicist metaphor, no irrelevant bromide that we are all part of one another must be permitted to obscure this basic fact. If then the state is not us, if it is not the human family getting together to decide mutual problems, if it is not a lodge meeting or a country club, what is it? Briefly, the state is that organization in society which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area. In particular, it is the only organization in society that obtains its revenue not by voluntary contribution or payment for services rendered, but by coercion. While other individuals or institutions obtain their income by production of goods and services, and by the peaceful and voluntary sale of these goods and services to others, the state obtains its revenue by the use of compulsion, that is, by the use and the threat of the jailhouse and the bayonet. Having used force and violence to obtain its revenue, the state generally goes on to regulate and dictate the other actions of its individual subjects. One would think that simple observation of all states throughout history and over the globe would be proof enough of this assertion, but the miasma of myth has lain so long over its state activity that elaboration is necessary. What the state is. Man is born naked into the world, and needing to use his mind to learn how to take the resources given him by nature and to transform them, for example, by investment in capital, into shapes and forms and in places where the resources can be used for the satisfaction of his wants and the advancement of his standard of living. The only way by which man can do this is by the use of his mind and energy to transform resources, production, and to exchange these products for products created by others. Man has found that, through the process of voluntary mutual exchange, the productivity and hence the living standards of all participants in exchange may increase enormously. The only, quote, natural course for man to survive and to attain wealth, therefore, is by using his mind and energy to engage in the production and exchange process. He does this first by finding natural resources, and then by transforming them, by, quote, mixing his labor with them, as Locke puts it, to make them his individual property, and then by exchanging this property for the similarly obtained property of others. The social path dictated by the requirements of man's nature, therefore, is the path of property rights and the free market of gift or exchange of such rights. Through this path, men have learned how to avoid the jungle methods of fighting over scarce resources so that A can only acquire them at the expense of B, and instead to multiply those resources enormously in peaceful and harmonious production and exchange. The great German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer pointed out that there are two mutually exclusive ways of acquiring wealth. One, the above way of production and exchange, he called economic means. The other way is simpler in that it does not require productivity. It is the way of seizure of another's goods or services by the use of force and violence. This is the method of one-sided confiscation, of theft of the property of others. This is the method which Oppenheimer termed the political means to wealth. It should be clear that the peaceful use of reason and energy in production in the natural path for man, the means for his survival and prosperity on this earth. It should be equally clear that the coercive, exploitative means is contrary to natural law. It is parasitic, for instead of adding to production, it subtracts from it. The political means siphons production off to a parasitic and destructive individual or group, and this siphoning not only subtracts from the number producing, but also lowers the producer's incentive to produce beyond his own subsistence. In the long run, the robber destroys his own subsistence by dwindling or eliminating the source of his own supply. But not only that, even in the short run, the predator is acting contrary to his own true nature as man. We are now in a position to answer more fully the question, what is the state? The state, in the words of Oppenheimer, is the organization of the political means. It is the systemization of the predatory process over a given territory. For crime, at best, is sporadic and uncertain. The parasitism is ephemeral, and the coercive parasitic lifeline may be cut off at any time by the resistance of the victims. The state provides a legal, orderly, systematic channel for the predation of private property. It renders certain secure and relatively, quote, peaceful, the lifeline of the parasitic caste society. Since production must always precede predation, the free market is anterior to the state. The state has never been created by a social contract. It has always been born in conquest and exploitation. The classic paradigm was a conquering tribe pausing in its time-honored method of looting and murdering a conquered tribe to realize that the time span of plunder would be longer and more secure, and the situation more pleasant if the conquered tribe were allowed to live and produce, with the conquerors settling among them as rulers, exacting a steady annual tribute. One method of the birth of a state may be illustrated as follows. In the hills of southern Ruritania, a bandit group manages to obtain physical control over the territory, and finally, the bandit chieftain proclaims himself king of the sovereign and independent government of South Ruritania. And if he and his men have to maintain this rule for a while, lo and behold, a new state has joined the family of nations, and the former bandit leaders have transformed into the lawful nobility of the realm. How the state preserves itself. Once a state has been established, the problem of the ruling group or caste is how to maintain their rule. While force is their modus operandi, their basic and long-run problem is ideological. For in order to continue in office, any government, not simply a democratic government, must have the support of the majority of its subjects. This support, it must be noted, need not be active enthusiasm. It may well be passive resignation as if to an inevitable law of nature. But support in the sense of acceptance of some sort it must be, else the minority of state rulers would eventually be outweighed by the active resistance of the majority of the public. Since predation must be supported out of the surplus of production, it is necessarily true that the class constituting the state, the full-time bureaucracy and nobility, must be a rather small minority in the land, although it may, of course, purchase allies among important groups in the population. Therefore, the chief task of rulers is always to secure the active or resigned acceptance of the majority of citizens. Of course, one method of securing support through the creation of vested economic interest. Therefore, the king alone cannot rule. He must have a sizable group of followers who enjoy the prerequisites of rule, for example, the members of the state apparatus, such as the full-time bureaucracy or the established nobility. But this still secures only a minority of eager supporters, and even the essential purchasing support by subsidies and other grants of privilege still does not obtain the consent of the majority. For this is essential acceptance. The majority must be persuaded by ideology that their government is good, wise, and at least inevitable, and certainly better than other conceivable alternatives. Promoting this ideology among the people is the vital task of the intellectuals. For the masses of men do not create their own ideas, or indeed think through these ideas independently. They follow passively the ideas adopted and disseminated by the body of intellectuals. The intellectuals are, therefore, the opinion molders in society. And since it is precisely a molding of opinion that the state most desperately needs, the basis for age-old alliance between the state and intellectuals becomes clear. It is evident that the state needs intellectuals. It is not so evident why intellectuals need the state. Put simply, we may state that the intellectual's livelihood in the free market is never too secure, for the intellectual must depend on the values and choices of the masses of his fellow men, and it is precisely the characteristic of the masses that they are generally uninterested in intellectual matters. The state, on the other hand, is willing to offer the intellectuals a secure and permanent berth in this state apparatus, and thus a secure income in the panoply of prestige. For the intellectuals will be handsomely rewarded for the important function they perform for the state rulers, of which group they now become a part. The alliance between the state and the intellectuals was symbolized in the eager desire of professors at the University of Berlin in the 19th century to form the intellectual bodyguard of the House of Hohenzollern. In the present day, let us note the revealing comment of an eminent Marxist scholar concerning Professor Wittfogel's critical study of an ancient Oriental despotism. The civilization which Professor Wittfogel is so bitterly attacking was one which could make poets and scholars into officials. Of innumerable examples, we may cite the recent development of the science of strategy in the service of government's main violence-wielding arm, the military. A venerable institution, furthermore, is the official or court historian, dedicated to purveying the rulers' views of their own and their predecessors' actions. Many and varied have been the arguments by which the state and its intellectuals have induced their subjects to support their rule. Basically, the strands of argument may be summed up as follows. A. The state rulers are great and wise men. They rule by divine right. They are the aristocracy of men. They are the scientific experts, much greater and wiser than the good, but rather simple subjects. And B. Rule by the extent of government is inevitable, absolutely necessary, and far better than the indescribable evils that would ensue upon its downfall. The union of church and state was one of the oldest and most successful of these ideological devices. The ruler was either anointed by God, or in the case of absolute rule of many Oriental despotisms, was himself God. Hence, any resistance to his rule would be blasphemy. The state's priestcraft performed the basic intellectual function of obtaining popular support and even worship for the rulers. Another successful device was to instill fear of any alternative systems of rule or non-rule. The present rulers, it was maintained, supply to the citizens an essential service for which they should be most grateful: protection against the sporadic criminals and marauders. For the state, to preserve its own monopoly of predation, did indeed see to it that private and unsystematic crime was kept to a minimum. The state has always been jealous of its own preserve. Especially has the state been successful in recent centuries in instilling fear of other state rulers. Since the land area of the globe has been parceled out among particular states, one of the basic doctrines of the state was to identify itself with the territory it governed. Since most men tend to love their homeland, the identification of that land and its people with the state was a means of making natural patriotism work to the state's advantage. If Ruritania was being attacked by Moldavia, the first task of the state and its intellectuals was to convince the people of Ruritania that the attack was really upon them, and not simply upon the ruling caste. In this way, a war between rulers was converted into a war between peoples, with each people coming to the defense of its rulers with the erroneous belief that the rulers were defending them. This device of nationalism has only been successful in Western civilization in recent centuries. It was not too long ago that the mass of subjects regarded wars as irrelevant battles between various sets of nobles. Many and subtle are the ideological weapons that the state has wielded through the centuries. One excellent weapon has been tradition. The longer the rule of a state has been able to preserve itself, the more powerful this weapon, for then the X dynasty, or the Y state, has the seeming weight of centuries of tradition behind it. Worship of one's ancestors, then, becomes a none too subtle means of worship of one's ancient rulers. The greatest danger to the state is independent intellectual criticism. There is no better way to stifle that criticism than to attack any isolated voice, any raiser of new doubts, as a profane violator of the wisdom of his ancestors. Another potent ideological force is to deprecate the individual and exalt the collectivity of society. For since any given rule implies majority acceptance, any ideological danger to that rule can only start from one or a few independently thinking individuals. The new idea, much less the new critical idea, must needs begin as a small minority opinion. Therefore, the state must nip the view in the bud by ridiculing any view that defies the opinions of the mass. Listen only to your brothers, or adjust to society, thus becomes ideological weapons for crushing individual dissent. By such measures, the masses will never learn of the non-existence of their emperor's clothes. It is also important for the state to make its rule seem inevitable. Even if its reign is disliked, it will then be met with passive resignation, as witness the familiar coupling of death and taxes. One method is to induce historiographical determinism, as opposed to individual freedom of will. If the X dynasty rules us, this is because the inexorable laws of history, or the divine will, or the absolute, or the material productive forces, have so decreed, and nothing any puny individuals may do can change this inevitable decree. It is also important for the state to inculcate its subjects an aversion to any conspiracy theory of history, for a search for conspiracies means search for motives and an attribution of responsibility for historical misdeeds. If, however, any tyranny is imposed by the state, or venality, or aggressive war, it was caused not by the rulers, but by mysterious and arcane social forces, or by the imperfect state of the world, or if in some way everyone was responsible, "We are all murderers," proclaims one slogan, then there is no point to the people becoming indignant or resisting up against such misdeeds. Furthermore, an attack on conspiracy theories means that the subjects will become more gullible in believing the general welfare reasons that they are always put forth by the state for engaging in any of its despotic actions. A conspiracy theory can unsettle the system by causing the public to doubt the state's ideological propaganda. Another tried and true method for bending subjects to the state's will is inducing guilt. Any increase in private well-being can be attacked as unconscionable greed, materialism, or excessive affluence. Profit-making can be attacked as exploitation and usury. Mutually beneficial exchanges denounced as selfishness, and somehow with the conclusion always being drawn that more resources should be siphoned from the private to the public sector. The induced guilt makes the public more ready to do just that. For while individual persons tend to indulge in selfish greed, the failure of the state's rulers to engage in its exchanges is supposed to signify their devotion to a higher and noble cause, parasitic predation being apparently morally and aesthetically lofty as compared to peaceful and productive work. In the present more secular age, the divine right of the state has been supplemented by the invocation of a new god, science. State rule is now proclaimed as being ultra-scientific, as constituting planning by experts. But while reason is invoked more than in previous centuries, this is not the true reason of the individual and his exercise of free will. It is still collectivist and determinist, still implying holistic aggregates and coercive manipulation of passive subjects by their rulers. The increasing use of scientific jargon has permitted the state's intellectuals to weave obscurest apologia for the state rule that would have only met with derision by the populace of a simpler age. A robber who justified his theft by saying that he really helped his victims by giving a boost to retail trade would find few converts. But when this theory is enclosed in Keynesian equations and impressive references to the multiplier effect, it unfortunately carries more conviction. And so the assault on common sense proceeds, each age forming the task in its own ways. Thus, ideological support being vital to the state, it must unceasingly try to impress the public with its legitimacy, to distinguish its activities from those of mere brigands. The unremitting determination of its assaults on common sense is no accident, for as Mencken vividly maintained, the average man, whatever his errors otherwise, at least sees clearly that the government is something lying outside him and outside the generality of his fellow man. That is a separate, independent, and hostile power, only partly under his control and capable of doing him great harm. Is it a fact of no significance that the robbing of government is everywhere regarded as a crime of less magnitude than robbing an individual or even a corporation? What lies behind all this, I believe, is a deep sense of the fundamental antagonism between the government and the people it governs. It is apprehended not as a committee of citizens chosen to carry on the communal business of the whole population, but as a separate and autonomous corporation, mainly devoted to exploiting the population for the benefit of its own members. When a private citizen is robbed, a worthy man is deprived of the fruits of his industry and thrift. When the government is robbed, the worst that happens is that certain rogues and loafers have less money to play with than they had before. The notion that they have earned that money is never entertained. To most sensible men, it would seem ludicrous. How the state transcends its limits. As Bertrand J. Fouvenel has sagely pointed out, through the centuries men have formed concepts designed to check and limit the exercise of state rule, and, one after another, the state, using its intellectual allies, has been able to transform these concepts into intellectual rubber stamps of legitimacy and virtue to attach to its decrees and actions. Originally in Western Europe, the concept of a divine sovereignty held that kings may rule only according to divine law. The kings turned the concept into a rubber stamp of divine approval for any of the king's actions. The concept of parliamentary democracy began as a popular check upon absolute monarchical rule. It's ended with Parliament being the essential part of the state and its every act totally sovereign. As he concludes, many writers on theories of sovereignty have worked out one of these restrictive devices. But in the end, every single such theory has sooner or later lost its original purpose and come to act merely as a springboard to power, by providing it with the powerful aid of an invisible sovereign whom it could in time successfully identify itself. Similarly, with more specific doctrines, the natural rights of the individual enshrined in John Locke and the Bill of Rights became a status right to a job. Utilitarianism turned from arguments for liberty to arguments against resisting the state's invasions of liberty, etc. Certainly, the most ambitious attempt to impose limits on the state has been the Bill of Rights and other restrictive parts of the American Constitution, in which written limits on government became the fundamental law to be interpreted by a judiciary supposedly independent of the other branches of government. All Americans are familiar with the process by which the construction of limits in the Constitution has been inexorably broadened over the last century, but few have been as keen as Professor Charles Black to see that the state has, in the process, largely transformed judicial review itself from a limiting device to yet another instrument for furnishing ideological legitimacy to the government's actions. For if a judicial decree of unconstitutional is a mighty check to government power, an implicit or explicit verdict of constitutional is a mighty weapon for fostering public acceptance of ever greater government power. Professor Black begins his analysis by pointing out that the crucial necessity of legitimacy for any government to endure. This legitimacy signifying basic majority acceptance of the government and its actions. Acceptance of legitimacy becomes a particular problem in a country such as the United States, where substantive limitations are built into the theory on which government rests. What is needed, adds Black, is a means by which government can assure the public that its increasing powers are indeed constitutional. And this, he concludes, has been the major historic function of judicial review. Let Black illustrate the problem. The supreme risk to the government is that of disaffection and a feeling of outrage widely disseminated throughout the population, and loss of moral authority by the government as such, however long it may be propped up by force or inertia or the lack of an appealing, immediately available alternative. Almost everybody living under a government of limited powers must sooner or later be subjected to some governmental action which, as a matter of private opinion, he regards as outside of the power of the government or positively forbidden to the government. As a man is drafted, though he finds nothing in the Constitution about being drafted, a farmer is told how much wheat he can raise, he believes, and he discovers that some respectable lawyers believe with him that the government has no more right to tell him how much wheat he can grow than he has to tell his daughter whom she can marry. A man goes to the federal penitentiary for saying what he wants to, and he paces his cell reciting, "Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech." A businessman is told what he can ask, and must ask, for buttermilk. The danger is real enough that each of these people, and who is not of their number, will confront the concept of governmental limitation with the reality, as he sees it, of the flagrant overstepping of actual limits and draw the obvious conclusion as to the status of his government with respect to legitimacy. This danger is averted by the state's propounding doctrine that one agency must have the ultimate decision on constitutionality, and that this agency, in the last analysis, must be a part of the federal government. For while the seeming independence of the federal judiciary has played a vital part in making its actions virtual holy writ for the bulk of the people, it is also and ever true that the judiciary is part and parcel of the government apparatus and appointed by the executive and legislative branches. Black admits that this means that the state has set itself up as judge in its own cause, thus violating a basic judicial principle for aiming at just decisions. He brusquely denies the possibility of any alternative. Black adds, "The problem, then, is to devise such governmental means of deciding his will, hopefully reduce to a tolerable minimum the intensity of the objection that the government is judge in its own cause. Having done this, you can only hope that the objection, though theoretically still tenable, will practically lose enough of its force that the legitimating work of the deciding institution can win acceptance." In the last analysis, Black finds that the achievement of justice and legitimacy from the state's perpetual judging of its own cause as something of a miracle. Applying his thesis to the famous conflict between the Supreme Court and the New Deal, Professor Black keenly chides his fellow pro-New Deal colleagues for their short-sightedness in denouncing judicial obstruction. The standard version of the story of the New Deal and the court, though accurate in its way, displaces the emphasis. It concentrates on difficulties. It almost forgets how the whole thing turned out. The upshot of the matter was, and this is what I like to emphasize, that after some 24 months of balking, the Supreme Court, without a single change in the law of its composition or indeed its actual manning, placed the affirmative stamp of legitimacy on the New Deal and on the whole new conception of government in America. In this way, the Supreme Court was able to put the quietus on the large body of Americans who had strong constitutional objections to the New Deal. Of course, not everyone was satisfied. The Bonnie Prince Charlie of constitutional commanded laissez-faire still stirs the hearts of few zealots in the highlands of choleric unreality, but there is no longer any significant or dangerous public doubt as to the constitutional power of Congress to deal as it does with the national economy. We had no means, other than the Supreme Court, for imparting legitimacy to the New Deal. As Black recognizes, one of the major political theorists who recognized, and largely in advance, the glaring loophole in a constitutional limit on government of placing the ultimate interpreting power in the Supreme Court was John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was not content with the miracle, but instead proceeded to profound analysis of the constitutional problem. In his disquisition, Calhoun demonstrated the inherent tendency of the state to break through the limits of such a constitution. A written constitution certainly has many and considerable advantages, but it is a great mistake to suppose that the mere insertion of provisions to restrict and limit the power of government, without investing those for whose protection they are inserted with the means of enforcing their observance, will be sufficient to prevent the major and dominant party from abusing its powers. Being the party in possession of the government, they will form the same constitution of a man which makes government necessary to protect society, be in favor of the powers granted by the Constitution, and opposed to the restrictions intended to limit them. The minor or weaker party, on the contrary, would take the opposite direction, and regard them, the restrictions, as essential to their protection against the dominant party. But where there are no means by which they could compel the major party to observe the restrictions, the only resort left to them would be a strict construction of the Constitution. To this the major party would oppose a liberal constitution. It would be a construction against construction, the one to contract and the other to enlarge the powers of the government to the utmost. But of what possible avail could the strict construction of the minor party be against the liberal construction of the major, when the one would have all the power of the government to carry its construction into effect, and the other be deprived of all means of enforcing its construction? In a contest so unequal, the result would not be doubtful. The party in favor of the restrictions would be overpowered. The end of the contest would be the subversion of the Constitution, the restrictions would ultimately be annulled, and the government would be converted into one of unlimited powers. Back to Rothbard. One of the few political scientists who appreciated Calhoun's analysis above of the Constitution was Professor J. Allen Smith. Smith noted that the Constitution was designed with checks and balances to limit any one governmental power, and yet had then developed a Supreme Court with a monopoly of ultimate interpreting power. If the federal government was created to check invasions of individual liberty by the separate states, who was to check the federal power? Smith maintained that the implicit in the check and balance idea of the Constitution was the concomitant view that no one branch of government may be conceded the ultimate power of interpretation. He writes, "It was assumed by the people that the new government could not be permitted to determine the limits of its own authority, since this would make it, and not the Constitution, supreme." The solution advanced by Calhoun, and seconded in this century by writers such as Smith, was, of course, the famous doctrine of the concurrent majority. If any substantial minority interest in the country, specifically a state government, believed that the federal government was exceeding its powers and encroaching on that minority, the minority would have the right to veto this exercise of power as unconstitutional. Applied to state governments, this theory implied the right of nullification of a federal law or ruling within a state's jurisdiction. In theory, the ensuing constitutional system would assure the federal government check any state invasion of individual rights, while the states would check the excessive federal power over the individual. And yet, while limitations would undoubtedly be more effective than at present, there are many difficulties and problems in the Calhoun solution. If indeed a subordinate interest should rightfully have a veto over matters concerning it, then why stop with the states? Why not place veto power in counties, cities, wards? Furthermore, interests are not only sectional, they are also occupational, social, etc. What of bakers or taxi drivers or any other occupation? Should they not be permitted a veto power over their own lives? This brings us to the important point that nullification theory confines in its checks to agencies of government itself. Let us not forget that the federal and state governments and their respective branches are still states, are still guided by their own state interests rather than by the interests of the private citizens. What is to prevent the Calhoun system from working in reverse, with states tyrannizing over citizens and only vetoing the federal government when it tries to intervene to stop that state tyranny? or for the states to acquiesce in federal tyranny? What is to prevent the federal and state governments from forming mutually profitable alliances for the joint exploitation of the citizenry? And even if the private occupational groupings were to be given some form of functional representation in government, what is to prevent them from using the state to gain subsidies and other special privileges for themselves, or from imposing compulsory cartels on their own members? In short, Calhoun does not push his path-breaking theory on concurrence far enough. He does not push it down to the individual himself. If the individual, after all, is the one whose rights are to be protected, then a consistent theory of concurrence would imply veto power by every individual, that is, some form of unanimity principle. When Calhoun wrote that it should be, quote, impossible to put or to keep it, the government, in action without the concurrent consent of all, he was perhaps unwittingly implying such a conclusion. But such speculation begins to take us away from our subject, for down this path lie political systems which could hardly be called states at all. For one thing, just as the right of nullification for a state logically implies the right of secession, so a right of individual nullification would imply the right of any individual to secede from the state under which he lives. Thus, the state has invariably shown a striking talent for the expansion of its powers beyond any limits that might be imposed upon it. Since the state necessarily lives by the compulsory confiscation of private capital, and since its expansion necessarily involves ever greater incursions on private individuals and private enterprise, we must assert that the state is profoundly and inherently anti-capitalist. In a sense, our position is the reverse of the Marxist dictum that the state is the executive committee of the ruling class in the present day, supposedly the capitalists. Instead, the state, the organization of the political means, constitutes and is the source of the ruling class, rather ruling caste, and is in permanent position to genuinely private capital. We may therefore say with de Jouvenel, only those who know nothing of any time but their own, who are completely in the dark as to the manner of the powers behaving through thousands of years, would regard these proceedings, nationalization, the income tax, etc., as the fruit of a particular set of doctrines. They are in fact the normal manifestations of power, and differ not at all in their nature from Henry VIII's confiscation of the monasteries. The same principle is at work, the hunger for authority, the thirst for resources, and in all of these operations, the same characteristics are present, including the rapid elevation of the dividers of the spoils. Whether it is socialist or whether it is not, power must always be at war with the capitalist authorities and despoil the capitalists of their accumulated wealth. In doing so, it obeys the laws of nature. What the state fears. What the state fears, above all, of course, is any fundamental threat to its own power and its own existence. The death of a state can come about in two major ways. A, through conquest by another state, or B, through revolutionary overthrow by its own subjects. In short, by war or revolution. War and revolution as two basic threats invariably arouse in the state rulers their maximum efforts and maximum propaganda amongst the people. As stated above, any way must always be used to mobilize the people to come to a state's defense in the belief that they are defending themselves. The fallacy of the idea becomes evident when conscription is wielded against those who refuse to defend themselves and are therefore forced into joining the state's military band. Needless to add, no defense is permitted them against this act of their own state. In war, state power is pushed to its ultimate, and under the slogans of defense and emergency, It can impose a tyranny upon the public such as might be openly resisted in time of peace. War thus provides many benefits to a state, and indeed every modern war has brought to the warring peoples a permanent legacy of increased state burdens upon society. War, moreover, provides to a state tempting opportunities for a conquest of land areas over which it may exercise its monopoly of force. Randolph Bourne was certainly correct when he wrote that, quote, "War is the health of the state, but to any particular state a war may spell either health or grave injury." We may test the hypothesis that the state is largely interested in protecting itself rather than its subjects by asking, which category of crimes does the state pursue and punish most intensely? Those against private citizens or those against itself? The gravest crimes in the state's lexicon are almost invariably not invasions of private person or property, but dangers to its own contentment. For example, treason, desertion of a soldier to the enemy, failure to register for the draft, subversion and subversive conspiracy, assassination of rulers, and such economic crimes against the state as counterfeiting its money or evasion of its income tax. Or compare the degree of zeal devoted to pursuing the man who assaults a policeman with the attention that the state pays to the assault of an ordinary citizen. Yet, curiously, the state's openly assigned priority to its own defense against the public strikes few people as inconsistent with its presumed raison d'être. How states relate to one another. Since the territorial area of the earth is divided among different states, interstate relations must occupy much of a state's time and energy. The natural tendency of a state is to expand its power, and externally such expansion takes place by conquest of a territorial area. Unless a territory is stateless or uninhabited, any such expansion involves an inherent conflict of interest between one set of state rulers and another. Only one set of rulers can obtain a monopoly of coercion over any given territorial area at one time. Complete power over a territory by state X can only be obtained by the expulsion of state Y. War, while risky, will be an ever-present tendency of states, punctuated by periods of peace and by shifting alliances and coalitions between states. We have seen that the internal or domestic attempt to limit the state in the 17th through 19th centuries reached its most notable form in constitutionalism. Its external or foreign affairs counterpart was the development of international law, especially such forms as the laws of war and neutrals' rights. Parts of international law were originally purely private, growing out of the need of merchants and traders everywhere to protect their property and adjudicate disputes. Examples are admiralty law and the law merchant. But even the governmental rules emerged voluntarily and were not imposed any international superstate. The object of the laws of war was to limit interstate destruction to the state apparatus itself, thereby preserving the innocent civilian public from the slaughter and devastation of war. The object of the development of neutrals' rights was to preserve private civilian international commerce, even with the enemy countries, from seizure by one of the warring parties. The overriding aim, then, was to limit the extent of any war, and the private citizens of the neutral and even the warring countries. The jurist F.J.P. Veal charmingly describes such civilized warfare as it briefly flourished in the 5th century Italy. Quote, "The rich burghers and merchants of medieval Italy were too busy making money and enjoying the life to undertake the hardships and dangers of soldiering themselves. So they adopted the practice of hiring mercenaries to do their fighting for them, and, being thrifty, businesslike folk, they dismissed their mercenaries immediately after the services could be dispensed with. Wars were, therefore, fought by armies hired for each campaign. For the first time, soldiering became a reasonable and comparatively harmless profession. The generals of that period maneuvered against each other, often with consummate skill, but when one had the advantage, his opponent generally either retreated or surrendered. It was a recognized rule that a town could only be sacked if it offered resistance. Immunity could always be purchased by paying a ransom. As one natural consequence, no town ever resisted. It being obvious that a government was too weak to defend its citizens had forfeited their allegiance. Civilians had little to fear from the dangers of war, which were only the concern of professional soldiers." End quote. The well-nigh absolute separation of the private civilian from the state's wars in the 18th century is highlighted by Neff. Quote, "Even postal communications were not successfully restricted for long in wartime. Letters circulated without censorship, with a freedom that astonishes the 20th century mind. The subjects of two warring nations talked to each other if they met, and when they could not meet, corresponded not as enemies but as friends. The modern notion hardly existed that subjects of any enemy country are partly accountable for the belligerent acts of their rulers. Nor had the warring rulers any firm disposition to stop communicating with subjects of the enemy. The old inquisitorial practices of espionage in connection with religious worship and belief were disappearing, and no comparable inquisition in connection with political or economic communications was even contemplated. Passports were originally created to provide safe conduct in time of war. During most of the 18th century, it seldom occurred to Europeans to abandon their travels in a foreign country which their own was fighting." End quote. And trade being increasingly recognized as beneficial to both parties, 18th century warfare also counterbalances a considerable amount of trading with the enemy. How far states have transcended rules of civilized warfare in this century needs no elaboration here. In the modern era of total war, combined with the technology of total destruction, the very idea of keeping war limited to the state apparatus seems even more quaint and obsolete than the original Constitution of the United States. When states are not at war, agreements are often necessary to keep frictions at a minimum. One doctrine that has gained curiously wide acceptance is the alleged Sanctity of Treaties. This concept is treated as the counterpart of the sanctity of contract. But a treaty and a genuine contract have nothing in common. A contract transfers, in a precise manner, titles to private property. Since government does not in any proper sense own its territorial area, any agreement that it concludes do not confer titles to property. If, for example, Mr. Jones sells or gives his land to Mr. Smith, Jones' heir cannot legitimately descend upon Smith's heir to claim the land as rightfully his. The property title has already been transferred. Old Jones's contract is automatically binding upon young Jones, because the former had already transferred the property. Young Jones, therefore, has no property claim. Young Jones can only claim that he has inherited from Old Jones, and Old Jones can only bequeath property which he still owns. But if at a certain date the government of, say, Ruritania is coerced or even bribed by the government of Moldavia into giving up some of its territory, it is absurd to claim that the governments or inhabitants of two countries are forever barred from a claim to reunification of Ruritania on the grounds of the sanctity of a treaty. Neither the people nor the land of Northwest Ruritania are owned by either of the two governments. As a corollary, one government can certainly not bind by the dead hand of the past a later government through treaty. A revolutionary government which overthrew the king of Ruritania similarly could hardly be called to account for the king's actions or debts, for a government is not, as is a child, a true heir to its predecessor's property. History as a race between state power and social power. Just as the two basic and mutually exclusive interrelations between men are peaceful cooperation or coercive exploitation, production or predation, so the history of mankind, particularly its economic history, may be considered as a contest between these two principles. On one hand, there is creative productivity, peaceful exchange, and cooperation. On the other, coercive dictation and predation over those social relations. Albert J. Nock happily termed these contesting forces social power and state power. Social power is man's power over nature, his cooperative transformation of nature's resources and insight into nature's laws for the benefit of all participating individuals. Social power is the power over nature, the living standards achieved by men in mutual exchange. State power, as we have seen, is the coercive and parasitic seizure of this production, a draining of the fruits of society for the benefit of non-productive, actually anti-productive, rulers. While social power is over nature, state power is power over man. Through history, man's productive and creative forces have, time and time again, carved out new ways of transforming nature for man's benefit. These have been the times when social power has spurted ahead of state power, and when the degree of the state encroachment over society has considerably lessened. But always, after a greater or smaller time lag, the state has moved into these new areas to cripple and confiscate social power once more. If the 17th through the 19th centuries were, in many countries of the West, times of accelerating social power and a corollary increase in freedom, peace, and material warfare, the 20th century has primarily been an age in which state power has been catching up, with a consequent reversion to slavery, war, and destruction. In this century, the human race faces, once again, the virulent reign of the state now armed with the fruits of man's creative powers, confiscated and perverted to its own aims. The last few centuries were times when men tried to place constitutional power and other limits on the state, only to find that such limits, as with all other attempts, have failed. Of all the numerous forms that governments have taken over the centuries, of all the concepts and institutions that have been tried, none has succeeded in keeping the state in check. The problem of the state is evidently as far from solution as ever. Perhaps new paths of inquiry may be explored if successful final solution of the state question is ever to be attained. So, that is it. The audiobook is generally about an hour, so I think that was like about an hour and 15 minutes of reading. It's a free PDF. I know for me, reading it out loud is very helpful. I've read it, listened to it on audiobook, and now read it out loud. Not saying you have to do all of those. But even reading it out loud, there were times where I got goosebumps reading this out loud. And when I was stumbling over my words, my brain was actually trying to process what I said. Obviously, I'm an anarcho-capitalist, but this is one of those books where I feel like every once in a while you just need a refresher. For those of you wondering, the PDF is about 60 pages. Really, it's probably like 50 something with the foreword, the table of contents, and all that. So you're looking at 50 to 60 pages. Totally readable. It's more like a very small novella than it is a book, which is why I'm reading it on stream. The audio book on Mises.org is about an hour and a few minutes long. So it's very listenable. It's very readable. It's very succinct. I feel like Rothbard does one of the best jobs possibly ever. And the part about the state and intellectuals, I am literally getting goosebumps. Just reading through this today, I knew that this was going to be topical. But reading this today, seriously, multiple times reading this, I got goosebumps. This is so... Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard is a living text, if there ever was one. It is so transferable. into today that it's almost spooky. In fact, I feel like, as opposed to when Rothbard wrote this to current present day, it might just be getting more and more relevant. So that's why I wanted to read it. I wanted to get it out there. Stumbled over words a couple times. Cut me some slack. This is my first reading stream. And it actually, usually if I'm going to do something like this, I will reread right before. But I have not read this in probably about 2 years it's been since I read this. So if you're just joining or you joined halfway through, I was reading through the PDF on Mises.org of Anatomy of the State by Murray Ann Rothbard. And I felt this was a very important read. I'm between the shirt that I'm wearing and this PDF of Anatomy of the State, I'm just processing like what I just read. Do I need to say anything else? I really didn't mean for this to be a question and answer about Anatomy of the State. I simply wanted to get on, do a live stream, read Anatomy of the State to you, and force you to listen to it. No, not force you to listen to it. Thanks. I mean, hopefully my reading wasn't too bad. I'm not really a fan of my voice, but I know a lot of people listen to my live streams while they're working out, or they'll listen to them play back. I think this is going to be a great one to just listen to played back. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I see a lot of people in the chat talking about how they enjoyed it. Please, if you're joining the stream, if you don't want to listen to me, I am quite literally just reading off of the PDF in Anatomy of the State that's on Mises.org. That is what I am reading. There is an audiobook. Let's see, who's the audiobook read by? I forget who the audiobook is read by. I think it says. The audiobook is narrated by Harold Fritschy. Can't pronounce last names. He has a very nice voice, a very deep, it's a very good narrative voice. If you were listening to this and want a different kind of voice or want something to listen to, if you're watching this back, I will be putting a direct link to the page where you can either listen to the audiobook or download the free PDF. I highly encourage you to do that. I have now discovered that I have somehow misplaced my paper copy of Anatomy of the State, so thank you to Mises Institute for providing this stuff for free. This is crazy. This is why I'm such a big proponent of the Mises Institute and all the great work they do. You can buy a paper copy of Anatomy of the State at Mises.org as well. I'll put that in the description link too. I know my room was a bit echoey. I'm in a hardwood room. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. Hopefully it was okay. If you're just joining, I just finished reading Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. I've never done this kind of stream before. If you guys want more streams like this, I don't know. I feel weird just narrating things, but the reason why I did this today, like I talked about at the very beginning of this video, is because this text is so relevant. I don't know if I can zoom in, I still have goosebumps. Anatomy of the State is a description of the state as a political entity, what it is, how predatory it is, and how parasitic it is. It's basically a systematic breakdown of the state itself. Its anatomy, if you will. So, it's a great book. It's a book I highly recommend to anyone even considering getting into libertarianism. I don't care if you're a minarchist, ANCAP, voluntarist, whatever you call yourself. Read this book. It's 50, I think someone said it goes from page 5 or 9 to 55. So it's not long. It's an hour-long audio listen. I think I read it for about an hour in between my ramblings. I'm going to scroll back and look at some comments. And for anyone watching back, if you're just joining and you're going to watch back, I will be putting timestamps of when I'm actually reading to finish reading the book if you don't want to listen to my rambling at the beginning and the end of the stream. Though I think I went on a pretty good rant at the beginning of the stream, if I do say so myself. I'm with Hans Hermann Hoppe. I think one of the biggest problems with the modern libertarian movement, so to speak, is that people don't read much. It's ridiculous, but it's one of my favorite Hoppe quotes. He's correct. When I first got into libertarianism, I was such just base level, grasping for any political ideology. I think I pretty much came from a centrist apolitical to apolitical range. I probably leaned a little bit leftist just because most people that are apolitical, you grow up being told in school and all this, you tend to lean one way. But I wasn't interested in politics at all. But when I first got into libertarianism, I latched onto the slogans like taxation is theft and fiscally conservative, socially liberal. Ugh. And then I started asking for reading suggestions. Someone gave me The Law by Bastiat. That was my first read. I read that on the plane to DC to a Liberty convention. Blew my mind. Then somebody suggested Anatomy of the State by Rothbard, which we read tonight, because I was talking to someone and they're like, I think you should read this. It seems like you believe this, you just don't know how to articulate it, and this does that. And so I read it, and whoa. And then I listened to it, and now I've read it out loud. This is it, folks. This is it. I think I'm going to pop off. I'm picking up my puppy tomorrow. For those of you who didn't see, I'm getting a dachshund puppy. Her name is going to be Cheese. We're going to be mac and cheese. I'm really excited about it. So I do have to pop off because I do have to get up early. I have to get up, I have to drive 2 hours to pick her up and 2 hours home. So it's going to be a slog tomorrow. So I cannot be in a bad mood. I just finished reading Anatomy of the State, and I'm picking up a puppy to own tomorrow. So I'm really excited. I'll share pictures absolutely over on Twitter. You guys know where to find me, wherever my box is here. So, yeah, there's not really anything. This has been like such just me literally just reading. But I will say, I'm going to hop off of here in about probably 5 minutes. But if you listen to this, if you caught half of it, you caught the beginning, you caught the end, you're watching this replay or listening to this replay. If you have any reservations at all, you want some more reading suggestions, there are a couple lists I would give you of other people, predominantly anarcho-capitalists, of course, but there are general libertarian books if you're not quite ready for that yet, but you just listen to this, so you're ready. Please email me. I check my email every day. My email is in my Twitter bio. My email is just my Twitter handle up here, kenziepuff@gmail.com. That's it. Put book suggestions or whatever in the title. I will personally email you book suggestions. Like I said at the beginning, we are living in one of the best times ever as libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, minarchists, whatever, to promote decentralization, and I absolutely will recommend you books. Rambler said I should make a video on my recommendations. That is a fantastic idea, but we all know I don't make videos. So if I don't have a video up in the next couple weeks, getting a puppy, so I might not stream as much, please email me. If you're like watching this, you're a new subscriber, you're a random Twitter follower. By the way, I hit 22,000 followers on Twitter today. I don't know how, because people are getting mass banned, but I'm going to take that as a sign that you all are interested in anarcho-capitalism. So we can talk about that. Hey, Fender over on Periscope, what's up? I will, let's say in the next month, I'm going to make a video with my reading suggestions, because that's a really, really, really good idea. Fantastic idea. And a lot of the things that I would suggest are free on Mises.org. You guys can get free PDFs. Or you can order the books if you want to. Yeah, oh, see, I jinxed it. Now I'm at 21.9K, so I did lose some followers. But, I've been gaining them. I've been gaining followers. It's really weird. Free libertarian material provided thanks to voluntary donations from many, many generous donors to the Mises Institute. So, in my opinion, it is very libertarian to read free PDFs off the Mises Institute. Of course, it is even more libertarian to donate, if you can, one time, or be a consistent donor to the Mises Institute, because I can say they are personally one of the greatest personal resources that I have found within the liberty movement, period. I have a video on my channel of me attending Mises University, which is essentially an economics boot camp. I hate to call it a boot camp, but for me, my brain was just, my brain was blown. I went 3 or 4 years ago now to Mises University. I want to get back so bad. I need to go back to Auburn, Alabama. That's where Mises Institute is. Awesome place, awesome people, awesome resources, mostly free articles written by great people, free PDFs, free audiobooks. I promise this is not a commercial and I am not sponsored, but it's such a good resource for young libertarians, or new libertarians. I shouldn't say young, I should just say new. So yeah, I didn't really mean to make this a commercial, but another thing I will address really quick at the end here, I'll put timestamps for everything if you want to go back and watch, is a lot of people have been asking me if I'm going to be on alternative platforms because of the obvious that's happening right now. We could call it the happening, even. Not a Ron Paul happening, a very anti-Ron Paul happening. People are getting kicked off social media left and right. If I get kicked off Twitter, I probably won't be back. At least not in a non-anonymous form. We'll just put it that way. I've got some big plans for my life in the next year or so. And social media is a distraction. I love interacting with you all. Obviously, if I get kicked off Twitter, I'll still be on YouTube, I'll still be on Facebook, I'll still be on whatever I can be on. The only alternative platform I can see myself maybe uploading videos on is BitChute. I don't have a BitChute as of now. I might consider that within the next month or so, obviously, depending on how things go. But besides that, I don't plan on getting on alternative platforms. Not because I don't care, I don't think it's important. I just personally, I'm finding fulfillment, quote unquote, or interest at all in social media less and less. So I'll still be cosplaying, I'll still be costuming. But I just don't really care enough to go to alternative platforms. I know that sounds really bad, and I am by no means disparaging anyone who is building an alternative platform or uses alternative platforms. Go ahead. But it's just really, I don't see myself doing that. That could change, but if I come back to Twitter, it will be 100% anonymous, I think. Just to throw that out there. I'm not getting on Parler. I still maintain that Parler is a psyop. I'm not interested in getting on Parler. I believe I actually do have a Minds account, but I have never used it. I don't even know what my username is, but I think I remember making a Minds account at one point. Spectator said, a little late inquiry. I have no idea if you answered such a similar question as this, but as a libertarian yourself, what are your thoughts on porn/sex work, for example, its effect on individuals and society? Jeez, I mean, I was gonna get off in 5 minutes, but no, I'm just kidding. I'll address that. So I have a bit of a unique. It's not really unique at all. I think a lot of people have this. I say unique. You'll understand why I say unique. I'm not saying I'm not like other girls or something. I think I have a different opinion on this because, one, for those of you who don't know, I'm Christian. I am Lutheran. Yes, that's right. Catholics be warned. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a Lutheran Christian. That should give you some idea of what I think. I am libertarian and I'm anarcho-capitalist, but I have personally very, I hate to say traditional, whatever. There's not really a good word that I like for my views. Whatever. Now you should have a really good idea of what I'm going to say about this. I don't support degeneracy in any form. I think as libertarians, one of the most disastrous things that we have done is to say, well, what's the big deal? It doesn't affect me. Do what you want. Because I think that's very autistic. It's an autistic way to look at the world. It's very itemized. You are pretending as if everyone is just literally by themselves. It's like autistic individualism, like to the most extreme thing. And it's dumb because we interact with other people. I hate to say we live in a society. You guys have seen my Joker meme. We interact with other individuals. There are family units. There are community units. I cannot fathom, and I've always thought this was silly, when I looked more into libertarianism, how you could look at something like sex work, porn, whatever, and be like, well, it doesn't affect me, so do what you want. It's just dumb. It's stupid. Okay, yeah, I could shoot my dog, and it doesn't affect anyone, but would you consider that morally correct? I hope not, and if you do, are you a cop? Because I'm a little suspicious. You can do what you want, but that doesn't mean I have to support it or promote it. Because libertarians, libertines, quite frankly, will tell you, well, if you, as the infamous Joe Jorgensen, Angela Davis quoted tweet said, it's not enough to be anti-this. We must be actively whatever. That's what a lot of libertarians seem to think about sex work and stuff like that, and I think it's ridiculous. I'm trying not to cuss right now because I want this to be a PG stream for once. Yeah, just because you can do what you want doesn't mean I have to actively support it, and I sure as hell shouldn't have to pay for it either and subsidize your terrible, degenerate life decisions. I don't support sex work. I think it's degenerate. That's why I hate the phrase fiscally conservative, socially liberal, because it implies that fiscally I'm okay with limiting things, but socially, don't limit anything. No, don't be a shitty person. Oh, there I go. It's not hard. And the reason I feel like I have a little bit of a different perspective on this is I'm in the cosplay community. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it is costuming. Like if you see at Comic-Con, people dress up as superheroes. I dress up as anime characters, and predominantly anime characters, sometimes video game characters. And that community is so overrun with sex work that people, just this week, my husband was talking to someone on Facebook that was pissed off at him, and the guy tried to say that I have a secret OnlyFans and that I just don't want to tell him about it and blah blah blah. Like, that's how oversaturated my hobby is with sex workers. So I kind of have a bone to pick because I cosplay skin tight bodysuits. I'm not saying what I am doing is not trad by any means, but I don't do like bikini cosplays. If I'm wearing like a shorter skirt or dress in a cosplay, it's not because I want to, it's because I like that character and I'm trying to be true to that character. I don't sex things up for the sake of sexing things up. That's not who I am. That's not why I cosplay. I cosplay to be as accurate as I can to the character, to bring joy to fans of whatever particular series, whether it be anime, video game, whatever, that I am cosplaying, period. And that's my thing. And people have other things, and that's fine. But it is a little frustrating that I get accused of being a sex worker and even just flat out called a sex worker because I have a donation link in my bio that I don't provide exclusive content. I don't even sell t-shirts. I don't sell prints. I don't sell anything. I just have a donation link because people were saying, I like your costumes. How can I donate to you? So I provided a link. I don't put it in every post. I don't push it all the time. Some of you are probably like, you have a donation link? Yeah, it's in my Twitter bio. I don't ever talk about it because I'm just not really that kind of person. And I know it's very libertarian to voluntary donation, but it just feels weird to constantly push something when I'm not providing anything really but enjoyment from cosplaying a character. And I don't make my own cosplays. I buy them. So I don't feel right producing content based off of other people's work. So I have a donation link in case people want to donate, but that's it. But yet I still get accused of being a sex worker, inappropriate, blah, 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 because there are so many people in my hobby that do it. And fine, whatever, you do you, but I don't like it. And I'm really frustrated I always get compared to them. So I'm just out here trying to represent for the girls without fake boobs. That's really all I'm saying. I'm out here trying to represent for the under 5'5", petite demographic where I don't have fake boobs and I don't do sex work. How is One Piece going? I'm gonna cry. I am so... Okay. Gora! My Gora cosplay will be... I will post my Gora cosplay by the end of January. I still have to make her teeth, and I haven't decided how I'm going to do that yet. But my Gora cosplay is coming out soon. Yeah, I'm not under 5 feet tall. Josh Williams asked, how is One Piece going? Okay, guys, I'm tearing up right now. Let's see what. I am so emotionally invested in One Piece, guys. I don't want to watch the next episodes because I'm worried the character I like is going to die, and I'm traumatized. Though my husband keeps saying no one dies in One Piece, and I know that, but no, I'm not going to spoil anything. I won't talk about what happened. For those of you who don't know, I am like 400 to 500 episodes into One Piece. I'm not going to talk about spoilers. Because I don't like when people spoils it to me. Yeah, I'm not talking about spoilers. I won't spoil anything, but I am thoroughly enjoying One Piece. I am heavily emotionally invested in this anime, and I hate it. Gabraham Sandwich on Periscope said, "Long rant about degeneracy. Starts talking about anime." I mean, it's such a misnomer that anime is all degenerate. It's so stupid. I feel like people don't know the difference between anime and hentai, which is actually like cartoon porn. Like, they're not the same thing. Don't get me on this. It makes me so mad. And there is heavily fan service anime, and then there's shonen, and they throw some fan service into the shonen, like, but for the most part, you're not watching it like, whoa, look at that girl's boobs, or look at that skirt. You're watching cool robots fight, or pirates and stuff. Like, come on. Don't get me on it. I really, like, we just went from Rothbard to this. Who did this to me? Who asked me this question? I forget who it was. Josh Williams said, "If you're enjoying it, then something you may like to know is Oda said that the final arc will make the current one you are on look like unimportant filler." I read Oda's message to his fans for the 1000th chapter. I'm not like... I have so many thoughts. I'm not going to say any spoilers, though. But it's really good, guys. And I was one of those people that was like, "Oh, I hate the animation style, and it's so long, blah, blah, blah." I got like, how many episodes was I in before I started crying? I don't know how many episodes I was in, but there was a point my husband looked over, and he was sitting on one couch, I was sitting on the other couch laying down, watching, like this, like trying to like hide my face, and he's like, what is wrong with you? And I'm like, and I look up, and I just have like tears streaming down my face. I'm like, he really said that to him. He really did. I'm really invested. I'm real invested, guys. Me and my puppy are gonna sit down this weekend and watch some One Piece. Me, mac and cheese, watching some One Piece. It kind of rhymes. I'm very excited. Very, very excited. Ola300 on YouTube said, "You're the only cosplay person I follow and I'm interested in because you keep it on topic and not in your face sexual." Thanks. And you know, I'm not going to toot my own horn, but I have had people tell me that they like my cosplay because like their kids can like look at it and be like, "Oh, I like that character," and they don't have to worry about like PG-13, you know, stuff or rated R stuff. Which, that's great. I like that. I had this, it was so cute. One of my Facebook friends, like 11-year-old, I think she is, daughters, like drew me a picture and she messaged it to me. I was like, she's such a fan. And I'm like, that's the cutest thing ever. Like, I don't think that kids are going to be looking at my cosplays, but I like that because that's why I know people cosplay for different reasons, whatever. If you're literally just cosplaying to make money, whatever, you do you. And like I said, people do donate to me, and I appreciate everybody that does so much. But it's not my job, it's my hobby, and I want to do it because I enjoy it. I don't want to make it, I really have no desire to make it a job. It's a hobby. And the best part about the hobby is me dressing up as a character and somebody running up to me at a convention or replying to me online and be like, "Whoa, this is so good. This is my favorite series, blah, blah, blah. What's your favorite episode? Blah, 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 blah." That's why, as a general rule, the rules that are exempt from this are Samus, because I cosplayed that for Samus and Zelda are the... Samus, Zelda, I feel like there's another one. Samus and Zelda are the ones that come to mind. Those cosplays, I don't want to say I'm not a fan of the series, but I haven't played the games. My husband enjoys them, so I cosplayed those because I'm a good wife. But besides that, if you see me cosplay something like my Agent Scully from X-Files cosplay, X-Files is my favorite television series. I'm cosplaying it because I genuinely enjoy it, and I want other people to be scrolling through their Twitter feed, scrolling through Facebook, see a cosplay, and be like, whoa, that's so cool. That's the goal. So, and if it's not your thing and you're like, what is this scary outfit she's wearing, then it's cool too. Well, you can listen to my stream of reading Rothbard. Alright, guys. It is almost 10, and I have to go pick up a little dachshund puppy tomorrow morning. So I have some things to prepare for the car ride tomorrow, and yes, I will be posting pictures on my Twitter, which you can follow me if it still exists, tomorrow morning. Yeah, and I'm gonna be putting the link to Anatomy of the State. You can read it or listen to it yourself at the link below. If you're listening to this back, I will put it in then. And I will also put in all my social media links so that you can follow me elsewhere if you would like. I'm on Instagram. I have 2 different Facebook pages, one for cosplay and one for this YouTube channel and more political things. And I am gonna go to sleep now. But thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this was a white pill. I hope if you're listening to this that you enjoyed this little discussion. If you're watching right now, I hope you enjoy when you go back and listen. And don't get discouraged, because that is what the state wants. And we will end on that tonight. And of course, everyone, as always, stay comfy.